Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Oughton, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes the knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event and to preserve the timeless ideals on which this nation was established. Those ideals, such as liberty, equality, freedom, civic responsibility, natural and civil rights, and the rule of law, shaped our nation's history as well as other countries worldwide, and are just as important and relevant today as they were at the outset of the Revolutionary War in 1775. Along with this lecture tonight, the Institute's work includes supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibits and other exhibitions and historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation and providing resources to classrooms that assist teachers, students, and scholars alike. Tonight's author's talk features Professor Ricardo A. Herrera of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, discussing his new book, Feeding Washington's Army, Surviving the Valley Forge Winter of 1778, and is made possible in part by a generous gift provided by the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati. During the 1778 winter campaign at Valley Forge, the Continental Army launched its largest and riskiest operation. Not a bloody battle against British forces, but a campaign to feed itself and prevent starvation during the long encampment. In this new history of the Continental Army's Grand Forage of 1778, Professor Herrera brings to light the Army's Herculean efforts to feed itself, support local and continental governments, and challenge the British Army. Highlighting the missteps and triumphs of both General George Washington and his officers, as well as ordinary soldiers, sailors, and militiamen, Feeding Washington's Army moves far beyond the oft-told heroic and mythical tales of Valley Forge and digs deeply into its daily reality, revealing how close the Continental Army came to succumbing to starvation and how strong and resourceful its soldiers and leaders were. Ricardo A. Herrera is professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, where he teaches in the Department of National Security and Strategy. Previously, he was a professor of military history at the School of Advanced Military Studies, or the SAMS, of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he taught for 10.5 years. Prior to joining the SAMS, he spent 6 years teaching, leading, and designing staff rides at the Combat Studies Institute, U.S. Army Combined Arms Center, also at Fort Leavenworth. From 2002 through 2006, he was an assistant professor of history at Mount Union College while serving as director of honors from 2005 to 2006. Throughout his career, he has been awarded several research fellowships, including a visiting fellowship at Maynooth University Arts and Humanities Institute of the National University of Ireland, a residential research fellowship at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington in Mount Vernon, a residential research fellowship at the David Library of the American Revolution, a research fellowship at the Society for the History of the Early American Republic, and not to be biased by saying I'm saving the best for last, a Society of the Cincinnati Scholar Research Fellowship in 2015. He has also published several articles, chapters, and books, including For Liberty and the Republic, The American Citizen as a Soldier, 1775 through 1861, published by the New York University Press in 2015. Now, before I turn things over to Professor Herrera, a few housekeeping items are in order for those of you joining us on Zoom this evening. Following this evening's talk, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Professor Herrera using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function. One of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming back to Anderson House, Professor Ricardo Herrera.
Thanks so much for that wonderful send-up, Andrew. Thank you all for being here. The Society of Cincinnati, Anderson House, the Institute, all of this. Before I begin, a little bit of boilerplate. Nothing I say tonight reflects anything vaguely related to the US Army or the US government. These are all my own views, therefore I'm now safe. I can't imagine that there are so many people who would be interested in a story about the Continental Army going for takeout. So, at heart, all men are somewhere around 12 years old. And I want to let you in on a little secret, something that warped my mind at an early age. So if we could go to this for just a few minutes.
Then, that terrible winter at Valley Forge. 6 feet of snow. The men's equipment was poor. Their electric blankets tattered and full of shorts. The enemy fleet was
That's great.
bottled up in the harbor.
Great, thanks so much. And I can't believe Ellen has never seen this wonderful bit of American art. But let me talk to you a little bit about this. This work has really been a labor of love, and I'm always happy to talk about it. In any case, as I said, thank you all for being here. I can't believe I'm really flattered that you would come. This thing began as not a book. It began as a staff ride. For those of you who are unfamiliar with staff rides, let me give you the short version. A staff ride is the focused study of a campaign or battle that takes place on the actual ground that the events happened. You go to the site where the decisions or the action took place, and then ideally, your students will talk to you about what transpired, what the officers, the soldiers, whatever the focus is, what the participants knew at that point in time, and then try to make sense of it. So it's very much a case of using history as applied history to educate, not to train, to educate the mind. And I've been doing this with primarily soldiers, primarily commissioned officers in the US Army for over 16 and a half years, and it's been wonderful. And it taught me a lot. This grew out of a staff ride moment. I was building a Philadelphia campaign staff ride back in 2010. You go to Philadelphia to talk about the War for Independence, you have to talk about Valley Forge. You've got to visit Valley Forge. Staff rides, though, are predicated very much upon movement. Valley Forge, static. I asked myself then, how do I engender movement into what is a largely static thing, which is the encampment at Valley Forge? So I re-envisioned it. I thought about Valley Forge rather than as an encampment, as something more modern, something many of you would recognize from the news over the past 20 years, the idea of the forward operating base, the FOB. So in my mind, this became FOB Valley Forge. This was not the army that many of us grew up with, this static Greek chorus that suffered in the winter, that bled, that starved, and waited while the British Army enjoyed all the luxuries that occupied Philadelphia could give it. Dancing, drinking, gambling, whoring, all of the occupations of 18th century armies in winter quarters. No, the Continental Army was not a static chorus. It didn't just stand around waiting to suffer. It was an active field army doing the stuff that field armies do today, field armies will do 50 years hence, that field armies did 70 years ago. It maintained observation posts. security lines. It sent out patrols to seek out the enemy, to seek out food as well, to help the commanding general, in this case, George Washington, develop his understanding of his opponent's intentions. So out of this teaching moment came up an article, a second article, and a book finally. Valley Forge, the location, it's all about location, location, location. Washington decides to select this based upon a mixture of concerns, military, political, and the political takes place at the national, such as it was, and local levels. It also has to do with symbolism. The Continental Army, I believe, was the armed manifestation, the representation of the American people in revolt, fighting for their political independence, their liberty. The Army was that representative. So long as the Army held together and maintained the field, so long as the Army opposed British rule and British arms, so long the revolution continued. After having fought the British Army throughout the Philadelphia campaign, which began in August of 1777 and continued on through the end of that year, the Continentals had given generally a pretty good account of themselves. Their senior officers in Washington in particular hadn't done so well. You know, and I would go so far as to say that while Washington became a fine strategist, he was at best a middling tactician. General Sir William Howe was hands down his superior when it came to a field fight. When it came to the big picture stuff, though, Howe was left in the dust. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. In any case, Washington decides, in consultation with his generals, he uses these councils of war in incredibly meaningful and important ways. In fact, I purposely stole some of these ideas from my students at SAMS. They told me, hey, this sounds like what we do with red teaming, which is when you get somebody to go and poke holes in your plans and your ideas and to tell you that your pretty plan is actually pretty ugly. When you get officers to go and take a look at what's wrong with it and expose all the potential difficulties, Washington uses his generals as this. He develops things that my modern students today would call branches and sequels. If we do this and we succeed, then what? If we do that and it doesn't succeed, then what? So what do we do next? And these are all things that modern officers would understand. George Washington and his generals were doing it. Different vocabularies, different terms, same ideas, I believe. So Valley Forge becomes the perfect stand-in for what's needed. It allows the Army to maintain a position in close proximity to the British, thereby challenging British pretensions to authority in southeastern Pennsylvania. It allows the Army to show that the British cannot hold any ground without the permission of the Continental Army. It also shows itself as the embodiment of the Second Continental Congress. So there, the Army serves as a function or as an arm of the political will of this American Republic that is trying to come into creation. It also serves as a bulwark to the local government, the government of Pennsylvania, to the government of New Jersey, because there are Continentals stationed across the river as well. Washington understands all of this, in part because he'd been a politician before the war. He wasn't just a soldier. He knew about people and emotion. He knew about the symbolism of politics, the symbolism of armed forces. More directly, holding a position there at Valley Forge, which of course is denoted by the blue circle, allows the Continentals to challenge the British Army for that most important thing of war, the ability to feed oneself, to sustain oneself. Without supplies, there's no fighting that goes on. So Washington then uses his army to challenge the British. He goes to Valley Forge. It's a good location in those ways. It's a bad location in others. The army will take post in December of 1777 and starve in a land of plenty. It's surrounded by rich farmland. It's surrounded by grain, cattle, swine, corn, you name it. It's got problems though, primarily the nature of the supply system, the quartermaster general and the commissariat, because of rules enacted by Congress, not to mess with soldiers, but out of concern for preserving liberty, this great fear of the grasping power that the army represented in their minds. Food, therefore, in this struggle becomes a weapon of war, and Washington understands it. He understands something about the British Army as well. The British Army's rule of thumb at this time was to have 6 months of supplies on hand. At only about 2 times, if I remember correctly, during the entirety of this 8-year war, did the British Army ever have 6 months worth of supplies. Most of its supplies came from England, others from depots in Ireland. Other supplies, such as forage, fresh meat, came from the local areas. So let's take a look at some of the people involved. I talked to you about what had taken place in terms of Washington making decisions. Back in as late as December of 1777, Washington, who was an aggressive commander, wanted to have one more fight with the British, and after that, determine what would take place. So just north of Philadelphia, he sets up a line of fortifications along a ridge line at White Marsh, and it's a wonderful location, high ground. The soldiers have dug in. You all remember the stories of Bunker Hill. Well, Sir William Howe remembered the reality of Bunker Hill. He's got Britain's one and only army. Most of the British Army was deployed in America trying to suppress this rebellion. He cannot risk this most valuable of resources, the red-coated soldier, nor can he squander the lives of his German auxiliaries, those soldiers we know better as Hessians. Washington is in these entrenchments, and he's begging Howe, come at me, please. Howe marches out with his army, looks, no, methinks not, and returns back to Philadelphia. This is when Washington starts to go through a series of conferences with his generals. He's actually thinking, should we attack Philadelphia? And this might seem like madness, because here the Continental Army has lost every battle in the Philadelphia campaign. I've jokingly said, and this is not meant as an insult, but I've jokingly said that the Continental Army was the best track team in North America. When it ran, nobody could catch it. Washington asks his generals, should we launch a winter offensive? And you might be wondering, wait a second, they've just lost a series of fights, and he wants to go in to a winter campaign? Why not? What had taken place just the year before at a place called Trenton? Crossing the Delaware, manhandling and taking most of a Hessian brigade, inciting the Forage War, the rising of the New Jersey militia, the Pennsylvania militia, driving back British forces nearly back to where they started in New York. Why not? The generals offer their counsel. Washington decides now is not the time. As much as I'd like to have a fight, it's not worth it. Part of it's decided when he takes a look at Philadelphia's fortifications. You'll see here fortifications across the neck. Along here, fortifications. Here, vicinity of 30th Street train depot, fortifications. Pontoon bridges along the Schuylkill. Here, the Royal Navy's Delaware Squadron. Washington decides it's not worth the attempt. Even if we are able to take Philadelphia, he writes to his commanders, the British can then withdraw to their ships, and what do we have but a burned out city, a destroyed city? It's best to take post. So he turns, after this series of discussions, to establishing a post in the Great Valley, as it was called. He sets up FOB Valley Forge. So take a look here at all of this. Here's Valley Forge. We've got a line of entrenchments. They cover most of the major axes, avenues of advance, as we would call them today in the modern military. There's a ford here, but it's covered by a fort, the Star Redoubt. The parade ground, should the enemy succeed in attacking, entrenchments along Mount Joy. So what Washington's engineers have done is design a defense in depth. To the front, and particularly those of you who have been to Valley Forge, all this ground to the front, cleared, sloping away, it offers good fields of fire for the artillery. So this is very much in keeping with modern military thinking of the age, and many of these concepts translate quite well to modern armies. So what's new is maybe not all that new in some cases. It goes back centuries. Proximity does not equal greater relevance, I would argue. Here are some of the places where the actions will take place that I'm about to talk to you. Valley Forge, here's Philadelphia. I was telling you that Washington has his soldiers maintaining a screen line, security post, if you will. Light Horse Harry Lee's got his troop of light dragoons out here to the southwest, about 6 miles. His soldiers are busy patrolling, riding back and forth, gathering intelligence, but also attacking British patrols that are probing American lines. His boss, operating off here to his east, Major Jameson, also further east, also Continental Infantry patrolling. This is an active war zone, not the place for a national drama. When the Grand Forge will start out, they'll march out of Valley Forge, work their way down here through Chester County. Nathaniel Greene will then cut Anthony Wayne loose, who will cross here to Salem, working his way northward. Lee, in the meantime, operating down here in northeast Maryland and in northern Delaware. The British will respond, striking here in Salem and also up here at Cooper's Ferry, today's Camden. There we go. So here we've got our two commanders, both roughly the same age, both experienced men. You know, to the right, General Sir William Howe, known to his family as the Savage. You know, a man of great physical strength, great physical courage, an inspiring soldier, but I believe very wanting in terms of the bigger picture understanding. Early on in the war, Howe had told his political bosses, particularly Lord George Germain, the colonial secretary, you know, it would be a really nice idea to have somebody over here who could coordinate military strategy, somebody who could direct the Army and the Navy to do all of these things that we need done, something like a viceroy. Germain doesn't do this. Germain believes that the local commanders should have as much autonomy as they need on the ground, and that they should not be interfered with by someone like him. Plus, Germain's got political baggage that dates back to the 7 Years' War. His opponent, of course, Washington. His experience has been as a colonel in the Virginia Regiment during the 7 Years' War, better known to us as the French and Indian War. Both of them have served as colonels, and in fact, the regiment is the highest organization in the British Army. There is no such thing as a permanent brigade or a permanent division. So the British Army, not used to some of the higher organizational things that might be needed in waging a war, particularly a war across over 1,000 miles of ocean. This war, by the way, is probably the biggest military effort that the British Army and Navy put forth until the 20th century. Something to think about. So who's the A team? We've got on our right the apostate Quaker, Nathaniel Greene, a man who was not allowed to march in formation with the militia company he helped found the Kentish Guards. Why? Because he had a limp, and it wouldn't look good when you're marching. So Wayne gets, not Wayne, but Greene gets his revenge. He gets appointed Rhode Island's senior general officer. Go ahead, don't let me march. I'll be your boss. Seconding him, Anthony Wayne. Wayne's a local boy. In fact, Washington had been thinking about assigning Wayne on this task early on, but he realized the significance of it. Washington knew that he was going to have to collapse his security line and try and turn it over to the Pennsylvania militia. There was a problem. The Pennsylvania militia wasn't all that crazy about serving. In its previous stints, it hadn't been paid. Plus, this takes them away from their homes. Plus, they just aren't that, many of them were not that crazy about actually engaging in combat. So a number of things going on. Washington is, with a risk this big, plus sending out a large chunk of his armed, able-bodied, and prepared soldiers on this expedition, he needs to put it in the hands of his best commander. Now, no offense to you fans of Hamilton, but Nathaniel Greene was his real right-hand man. Wayne will then serve under him. Separate will be Henry Lee Jr., who commands 5th Troop, 1st Continental Light Dragoons. He's better known to us as Light Horse Harry Lee. Now, Lee will not work directly under Greene. He will, however, communicate with him, which speaks really great volumes about the nature of the command relationships that Washington had helped nurture, had helped mature and grow within the Continental Army. Lee will report directly to Washington. Coming into this, sort of as a pickup player, if you will, is Captain John Barry, later Commodore. He gets to working with this when Wayne meets up with him in Delaware, or excuse me, in Delaware. And he asks him, hey, would you mind ferrying my brigade? And I'm using that term very generously, with about 300 soldiers. Would you ferry my guys across the river to Salem? And while we're doing this, I'd like you to basically be a 12-year-old boy, burn everything along the marshes, set fire to it, distract the British, keep them away from me. And by the way, also attack British shipping coming up the river. Keep doing what you've been doing. The two of them, I believe, seem to be cut from the same cloth. They both got this same adventurous and almost piratical spirit. They're aggressive, but they're also rather smart. There we go. Who's opposing them? When this expedition in February of 1778 goes out, Washington wrote fairly freely to one or two generals that he believed that the army was on the verge of collapse. He believed that he would either have to disperse or fall back. In both cases, that represented surrendering to the British, giving the British free rein in southeastern Pennsylvania. This is why he decides to opt for the Grand Forage of 1778. Finally, when Howe decides to react, and he doesn't do it when Greene is out in the field, he finally does it when Wayne crosses the river into New Jersey. And some of the orders, not orders, but some of the records left behind explicitly point out that we're there to have a slap at Mr. Wayne. They're out there to look for combat. So Howe dispatches some of his best officers. On our left, we've got Colonel Sterling, who commands 2 battalions of the Black Watch, the 42nd Foot. He's also got with him John Graves Simcoe, the fellow in the dark coat, the silver epaulet on his right shoulder. He was not, by the way, a homicidal maniac, as Tern would have you believe. He was actually quite an accomplished and serious officer, and probably one of the best light officers in the war, both sides. Light Horse Harry Lee being one of the other best ones. In between them, General Abercrombie, who commands the elite of the British Army, the light infantry, better known as, or more popularly known as the light bobs. These guys are the most athletic, the most intelligent. They're the soldiers that you want out there doing all the tough things. He'll send two battalions of light bobs down to Salem. Now, the light bobs will advance and try and catch Wayne while he's at Raccoon Creek. Wayne escapes with the shirt on his back and his boots and a few other things, but he escapes in a very close call. The Reverend Nicholas Collin, who's the rector of the Swedish church at Raccoon Creek, made an observation. He pointed out that while the Continentals looked like armed ragamuffins, ill-clothed, ill-shod, destitute, they were well-disciplined and well-behaved. When the British Army came in, professional soldiers, commanded by professional soldiers, disciplined, uniformed, armed, drilled. The average redcoat in the Reverend Collin's eyes was little better than a thief. Unless he was observed by his officers, he would steal the most trifling of things in people's households. Discipline was a major concern for both armies. Reverend Collin was an observer of some minor things that suggest larger problems within the British Army. Finally, on the far right, Captain Andrew Snape Hammond commands HMS Roebuck, a large frigate. His one frigate has got more firepower than both armies combined. His squadron outguns both armies by inordinate numbers. Because of that, or because of his vessels, the British have got more maneuverability along the river, something vitally important. Oh, sorry about that. The problem is, though, as the good captain tells us, I don't know of any river so difficult of navigation. I know it's a little bit difficult to pick up, but if you look here, going up the Delaware River, finally getting to Philadelphia, it's a narrow shipping channel. One of the comments, or one of the observations that Hammond makes in 1779 is that the current is too fast for him to maneuver very well. When the tide is going out, it's nearly impossible because he's under sail. If not under sail, he has sailors manning sweeps. We would call them oars. It takes a lot of manpower to work against that current. That shipping channel also limits his maneuverability. His deeper draft ships can't do much of anything. He also comments that nearly every place he goes, he's within artillery range of the enemy. So while he may have an advantage in some ways, in other ways it's mitigated by advantages given to the Continentals by the river, by Mother Nature, in other words. The armies, in fact, any army, is probably one of the most conspicuous engines of consumption that you will ever encounter. These numbers were compiled by two historians, Jacqueline Thibault and Wayne Bodle, when they did a wonderful 3-volume work on the Valley Forge encampment. But you can see this thing was a voracious machine of consumption. One of the problems that the Army had was the fact that there were no wagons to bring in any supplies. The estimate is something like 113 wagons were needed daily, each wagon holding something like 8 barrels, each barrel holding over 100 rations. There were only 8 wagons in camp. So one of the things that the foragers were doing was looking not just for food, not just for forage and fodder for the animals. They were also looking for harnesses. They were looking for wagons. They were looking for all the implements of war to help sustain this army. One of the things that takes place when Greene is out, he decides to introduce to the people of southeastern Pennsylvania, the people of Chester County, his version of the hard hand of war. At one point early on, a couple of local farmers decided to bring in goods to British lines. They were captured. Instead of trying them, Greene ordered that they be triced up. In other words, have their wrists tied to a tree or perhaps sergeant's halberds or an officer's spontoons, basically spear-looking things. Their shirts stripped from their backs, and each man given 100 lashes during the winter. He intended to send a message: "Thou shalt not supply the British Army." A few days later, Greene, who had previously been giving receipts and keeping accounts for all the farmers that he visited, decided, from now on, I am no longer going to give any receipts to anybody who decides to hide supplies from me. I hear their cries, and like Pharaoh, I harden my heart, he writes to Washington. He decides that if you hide supplies, his soldiers will seize them and you will get nothing in return. You're going to pay with some economic suffering for making us work harder than we need to work. Now, throughout all of this, all of the foragers are keeping accounts. I was not able to find anything from Greene's foragers, unfortunately, or many from Wayne's side, but I'll talk to you in a little bit about what Harry Lee left behind for us. By the way, the animals have to eat. This will give you an idea what was recommended anyway by books from the age. Of course, what goes in must come out. I won't bother with dealing with that. In any case, this is a tremendous strain on the Army as well. Now, one of the things that I encountered that really spoke to me was Henry Lee's account book. I was working at the Gloucester County, New Jersey Historical Society, going through the Hollingsworth papers. Went through the first box, nothing. I mean, I shouldn't say nothing. It was valuable stuff, but not for me. The second box, nothing for me. The third, the same story for the fourth box. I get to the fifth one, and I'm really hoping that there's something that's useful for me. I came across the account book for Captain Henry Lee's troop of dragoons. It's not polite to shout yippee in an archive, so I didn't, but I did inside my head. I found this account book, which is a fabulous resource for historians. I know every farmer that Henry Lee's troop of dragoons and also militiamen attached to him, every farmer they visited, how many hands high the horses were and their age that his men impressed. And they gave receipts for all these, by the way. The number of cattle, the number of swine, what was their valuation. I also was able to learn the names of the wagon drivers as well as the wagon masters. Something that really, and this was great, and this is worth an article on its own. So if there's an ambitious graduate student or a historian out there, hint, hint, go tackle this. There's a lot to be taken out of this book. This book, though, tells us Negro Joseph, Negro Tom, Negro Jack, Negro Cuff, and others were also drivers. Clearly, these were enslaved men. And to me, this spoke to the complexity of the American Revolution and the war for independence that took place within this much greater event, the Revolution. It suggests the story of the unfree serving on behalf of white political independence, white political liberty. Their masters getting whatever compensation may have been offered. They, however, doing as ordered, doing as told, because they had no rights under the system. And so it tells me that this American Revolution of ours collectively as Americans was not the simple feel-good story of good guys, bad guys, black and white. It's a kaleidoscopic struggle that's full of all the complexities that today exist, that have always existed in the human experience. And that to reduce it to simple good and bad, black and white, good and evil, really diminishes the humanity and the complexity and the importance of what took place. And that by looking at it much more completely, it really adds to the richness of the story of the founding of the United States. In the end, the Grand Forage helped the Army make it through the winter. It was one of these little, probably very prosaic expeditions in most soldiers' minds that may not have meant very much. And that's in part because they were involved in it. That's in part because records have gone missing or were never kept. And it's left to the historian to figure out the much larger story out of what remains. I'd like to just read a couple of excerpts from the conclusion to help tie all of this together. So if you'll bear with me. Small it may have been, but the Grand Forage of 1778 was great in its results. It contributed to the Continental Army's continued survival until the spring, the Army's continued support of continental and state authority, and its continued challenge to British authority. Moreover, the planning and execution intimated greater developments within the Army's leadership, even as it struggled with a ramshackle logistical system that threatened the Army's ruin on a regular basis. Over 1,500 Continentals, militiamen, members of the Commissariat and Quartermaster General's offices, free and enslaved wagoneers and others had foraged, driven, and transported the provisions and other supplies so vital to the main army encamped at Valley Forge. Foraging columns and purchasing agents had ranged across hundreds of square miles in southeast Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, northern and central Delaware, and northeast Maryland in search of cattle, sheep, swine, wheat, flour, and more. The marching columns under Major General Nathaniel Greene and Brigadier General Anthony Wayne had skirmished with enemy forces in the process. They and Captain Henry Lee's Light Dragoons had encountered scores of civilians whose sympathies ran from active and enthusiastic support to sullenness and open hostility. They had confronted people who simply wanted to be left at peace, the so-called disaffected who wanted nothing to do with the war. Throughout their foraging, Greene's, Wayne's, and Lee's soldiers had also come into close contact with the ethnic, religious, racial, and geographic diversity of the region and the complex military, political, and climatic conditions that all of those elements created as the foragers sought out provisions and supplies so badly needed. The Grand Forage was as much an act of desperation as it was a demonstration of George Washington's fortitude and strategic prescience. Washington faced a stark, unpromising, and uncompromising gamut of possibilities in February 1778. Without provisions, his best choice was dispersing somewhere into Pennsylvania's backcountry, somewhere beyond the reach of the British Army and beyond its competing foragers. Feeding the army would become an easier task, but retiring westward would also cede control of southeast Pennsylvania to the enemy and completely undercut any pretenses of an independent American government. Moreover, it raised the specter of emboldened loyalists rushing to the king's standard in defense of the crown. Bad as dispersal was, an even worse possibility threatened: mutiny. Mutinies ranged from protests and refusals by soldiers to perform their duties, up through the overthrow of officers and violence against them. Washington instead chose a third option. Determined to hold Valley Forge, challenge the British Army in Philadelphia, and uphold the revolutionary regimes of the Continental Congress in Pennsylvania, he launched the Grand Forage. It was a desperate act that ultimately succeeded. It demonstrated Washington's burgeoning talents and those of many of his subordinate commanders and his staff, even as it cast a pall over his opponent's performance, General Sir William Howe and some of his subordinate and associated commanders. The army that survived Valley Forge did so because of Washington's determination to hold his post and to his soldiers and officers' willingness to endure the suffering and privation. It speaks very much to the faith and trust that they had in Washington and he had in them. He had early on, or rather, he had long ago established a trust between himself and his officers and his soldiers. Did everyone have it? No, it never happens. Did most of them have it? Based upon what I've read, yes, they did. In the end, they were able to succeed by making desperate moves. The army held together, and eventually, with the coming of the French alliance, the widening of the war, and so much more, the Americans won their independence. This is just one small part in a much greater drama. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, if I insulted any of your ancestors, it was unwitting.
How many men were at Valley Forge under Washington?
About 10,000 will march in, and the numbers will fluctuate. So let me back up here. The total rations that are indicated, oh gosh, right in here, these are not quite precise. So when you see, for example, 23,061, that doesn't mean that it's for 23,061 soldiers. Officers had extra rations, and that was in part so that they could feed their servants, but also senior officers were expected to keep a table. In other words, invite junior officers over. And this was part of the relationship building. And I don't want to call it professionalization, but certainly the socialization of officers. But around 10,000, maybe 12,000 being the maximum. It becomes, I believe, the fourth largest city in North America.
And Howe's army? How many?
I'm sorry?
And Howe's army, how large?
Howe's army, roughly 15,000 or so. Oh, yes.
I was curious about the farmers' loyalties. I mean, are they trying at the beginning to sell their produce to the highest bidder, or many of them perhaps loyalists themselves, or were they more sort of apolitical? I was curious.
You've got a mix. I think I can say with great certitude, most farmers just want to be left alone. If you have any sense in between your ears, you don't want an army anywhere near you. If you're a farmer, those nice fences that you put up last season, they're gone. They're going to turn into firewood. If it's near an encampment, they may go in to help bolstering fortifications. Your wheat, it's gone. You know, all those chickens that you've got, they're gone. Your livestock, the army's going to seize it. You don't want to see soldiers anywhere near you. But the farmers run the gamut of loyalties, of allegiances, you name it, much as they did throughout all 13 colonies, all 13 states. I don't have the exact numbers. Most, though, as I said, would prefer to be left alone. They wanted to sell their goods. They were there to make a profit. They were engaged in these market economies, some of them extending, or that had previously extended across the Atlantic, or certainly into the West Indies. They would much prefer, whatever their loyalties, hard cash. Give me bullion, gold, silver, because continental paper was worthless, and it got more worthless by the day. And so, just on simple economic terms, if he wears a red coat, he's a better economic deal for you and your family's survival. Others, though, were quite willing to risk it all. In fact, when Wayne crosses into New Jersey, he's really fortunate in that when he's in Salem, he's working with local magistrates, many of them officers of the county militia, who will share with him the names of local farmers, property holders who would be willing to work with them, find property, even allow their animals to be impressed. And in fact, Wayne has got such a good intelligence network. He writes to a captain in the 7th Connecticut in these 2 wonderful little notes about this big in very faint pencil, who to visit and how much property each man holds. And to me, that was just a wonderful example of the ability of Wayne's intelligence network to penetrate, his working with the local militia, but also some of the willingness of farmers and local property holders to cooperate. So it's a mixed bag and runs the entire spectrum. I wish I knew more.
I'm wondering when General Washington and the leaders realized the difficulties that they were having. Were any provisions sent up from Mount Vernon? Were any of the families sending in provisions, whether it be food or blankets?
That's a great question. The Continental Army's supply system, and I'm talking about the quartermaster general, the commissary general, the clothier general, you name it, from the outset, basically a staggering, shambolic train wreck from start to finish. The moments that it worked were the rare ones. So getting supplies was greatly difficult. One of the problems, and I won't go into all the details, but the purchasing agents, and these are the guys who are going out and saying, hey, farmer, would you like to sell to the Continental Army? I've got a deal for you. And the farmer's like, no, thank you. So what the farmers have got, what these purchasing agents have to do, and the purchasing agents were all merchants before the war. And so they were relying on pre-war networks and contacts in order to talk to people to purchase these goods. They were also venturing forth their own money. Then they'd have to send receipts and wait for Congress to pay them. Oh, by the way, why aren't you buying more supplies? Because you haven't paid me for the supplies I bought earlier. Well, that's not our problem. You need to buy more supplies. And so these guys are risking their economic health on behalf of a government that is slow and untrustworthy of power. Most of the supplies that they're getting coming from the north, Connecticut being a major cattle and salt center. There are also large stocks of wheat in the area, but the transportation system has broken down. And so nothing much coming from Mount Vernon, most of the supplies coming from New England and the middle states. I'm sorry, sir.
The farmers weren't taking the risk, the purchasing managers were.
Say again?
The farmers weren't taking the risk. In other words, Green was
They were.
threatening to
The
steal
farmers-
their stuff if they didn't.
Yep. Yeah, the
Speak
farmers
for-
are taking great risk, either in selling to the British because there may be Continentals or Whig militia, rebel militia around, or if they sell to the Continentals, this money is worthless.
Oh, I see. I got it.
Excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Valley Forge, what makes Valley Forge so vexing? I mean, the Continental Army was in winter camp 6 or 7 other years in other locations, as I understand, even harsher winter conditions than Valley Forge. So what made Valley Forge so vexing from a supply situation? And why don't we hear about Jockey Hollow and New Windsor and other places the Continental Army wintered?
Yeah, that's it, and you're absolutely right. Valley Forge, it takes place, in fact, the entire war takes place during a period known as the Little Ice Age. And so there are incredible climatic conditions. And so dramatic swings in the weather. One day you may have ankle deep snow. The next day you've got thaw. The next day you've got flooding. And you can read these accounts of the variations in it. That sometimes the snow got so deep in Philadelphia, you could actually use sleighs in the streets. But Valley Forge comes to us, I think it's because it represents perhaps this, in American minds, this great crisis. Here's the main British Army that has captured the political capital of the United States. Although, truth be told, Philadelphia is just a city. its real importance is symbolic. There's certainly economic implications to it because it's a grain port that connects North America, or at least Pennsylvania, to the wider Atlantic world. But it's the political symbolism. You've got Washington coming off of a high at the end of 1776, and then a series of, I won't call them disasters, but let's face it, the Philadelphia campaign was not the shining moment for the Continental Army, but the Army holds together. And then we tie in some of the drama of, that my friend Mark Edward Lender has written about in terms of the cabal and these machinations against Washington. And you've got all of these pieces working together. And it also stands, the larger campaign, as this contrast to the glorious victory at Saratoga. And it makes Horatio Gates look like, maybe this is the guy that we should have in command. This Washington guy is really losing it. And so there are all these pieces coming together. And then I think that as the country matures, as it approaches its centennial in 1876, we see Americans, and this is not to cast aspersions, we all look for heroes, people to look up to, people to guide us, to inspire us. And the story of Valley Forge becomes this morality play, and there's probably much more to it that I'm missing. But you've got a variety of things all coming together, and Valley Forge becomes this set piece. Because you're absolutely right, Morristown, miserable winters both times. The snow is even worse. The soldiers are starving, but that's a kind of a constant if you're in the Continental Army. So I think all these pieces during the war, but then particularly afterward, really elevated in our national consciousness.
What did you find out about, like, with the camp followers and stuff that were in
I'm sorry,
camp?
second.
The camp followers?
Yeah,
I mean, they're a whole different idea in the Civil War than they are in the Revolution. But, you know, for the camp followers that were there, my understanding is they were supposed to get half ration.
You know, I have to plead ignorance about camp followers for the Continental Army in terms of their rations. There's a fairly recentish book, Following the Drum, but also probably the finest book is Following the Army by Holly Mayer, who's a wonderful historian. But certainly for the British Army, they were a certain number were accounted for within the Continentals. I'm not sure. Later on in the 19th century American Army, laundresses were actually given rations on the Army.
You've tackled most of the questions that are coming in from Zoom, but there is one question. You said that this started with a staff ride. How would you compare the terrain today as it was to, say, the historical map that you were showing? Could somebody envision the encampment by looking at the modern terrain?
Sure, and that's one of the great challenges of doing any staff ride. My view is that the terrain is both your classroom as well as a document to be interpreted as you're actually walking the document, which, you know, for a historian, this is really cool stuff. Man, women, nature, animals have all affected the terrain, and so it has been altered from its original state. The trick is to use maps of the period, artistic portrayals, written descriptions, to try and convey to the students something of what the ground looked like, or what you believe that it looked like at the time that the event took place. When you're, for example, when in doing the Battle of Brandywine, reading past the dense suburban tracts that have really marred that beautiful landscape. People have to live, I understand, but the landscape is so wonderful. Coming across those occasional, though, preserved patches of bare ground, you know, on Birmingham Hill, on Osborne Hill, and being able to see and get a better idea of what the ground may have looked like in 1777. Those are the moments that you really exploit. So making the best out of what you've got and trying to relay as truthfully as possible what you understand the ground to have looked like at that time.
Thank you. And another question. Can you talk to the aid from the Native Americans? Was there aid, and are there any records of it?
Yeah, I believe that within Oneida tribal tradition, there is an accounting of assistance rendered. In my research on this, there was nothing indicated about any assistance except through the normal supply channels and from the foragers. And so it's not to say that it didn't happen. It's something that I did not look for and therefore did not encounter in my work. Or I should say something that did not appear as a part of the research for my work.
All right, I think that'll do it.
Great.
One more round of applause for Professor
Thank you.
Herrera. Thank you again, Professor Herrera. That was absolutely fascinating. Great new perspective, and we appreciate you coming out and speaking with us tonight. And I hope this will entice all of you to purchase a copy of his book. There are a few limited copies left on the back table there, and he has kindly agreed to stick around and sign a few for you. So please don't rush. Be safe. Before we officially conclude tonight's program, however, I would like to invite you, as always, to visit the events page on our website, AmericanRevolutionInstitute.org/events, where you can learn more about our upcoming historical programs. Our next historical program is a lunch bite this Friday, July 8th at 12:30 p.m. Here at Anderson House, where I will be discussing a pair of saddle holster pistols that were once owned by Major General Nathaniel Greene and given to his aide-de-camp throughout the Southern Campaign, Nathaniel Pendleton. Both registrations, virtual and in person, are currently open for that, as well as all of our other future historical programs. So with that, as always, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here in person and on Zoom and supporting our mission. So with that, I wish you all a great evening, and until next time, good night.